So although my channel is focused a lot on DIY and tech, I do also do filmmaking. For a living, I work as a gaffer and a cinematographer, and 90% of my job is dealing with light. And one thing people always ask me is, how can I improve my lighting for cheap or for free? So I thought I'd go over 5 different ways you can do that. So the first thing I want to talk about is light quality. With different lighting units, we actually have scientific measurements for the different spectrums that they cover and how accurate they cover them. You hear a lot of these results stated as TLCI, CRI, SSI, but what we need to understand for this video is there's difference in the quality of certain lights that you get. To show this, I made this little block. It's 2 different light strips rated at 5600 Kelvin, so the same color temperature, so they should theoretically be the same color. But on this side, as you see on the bad side, we have $14 roll of light strips, cut off from a $14 roll of light strips. On this side, we have a light strip from a company called Lightgear, and they make expensive LED strips for film and video. And a meter of these LEDs can cost anywhere in the hundreds. It's easy to see the differences here. The bad strip is much bluer than it should be at 5600 Kelvin, and the colors are faded and a little bit harder to distinguish. Whereas the Lightgear strip is much more neutral, with the colors popping out a bit more and are clearly different from each other. Obviously there's a huge difference in the LEDs you saw there, and this video is called 5 free ways. So I'm not telling you to go out and buy expensive LEDs, but the same knowledge can be applied to your lights at home. Some examples I have here are a tungsten bulb from a dollar store and an LED bulb from the same dollar store. Now, the difference being that this burns an actual tungsten filament and this ignites phosphor with an LED diode. And with incandescent bulbs being an actual organic process, it naturally has much better colors versus an LED or a CFL bulb that use a little bit more complicated processes that sometimes muddy up the spectrum and can have adverse effects that you may not want for filming. They may be fine for everyday lighting in your house and to your naked eye, but to the camera it could actually have a lot of really bad effects. So let's take a look at some of those results on a human face. First up is an LED bulb, with probably the widest variety and quality. If chosen wisely, it could make a good choice for lighting. You can see that this bulb is actually fairly accurate. There's a little green in the skin, but overall not too bad. Next is the CFL bulb. These bulbs are easily distinguishable by the swirly fluorescent tubes. Unfortunately, these are often shipped with many beginner lighting kits. The gross greenish yellowish tone is immediately apparent. I would highly advise against these as it's never 100% correctable. Lastly is an incandescent or tungsten bulb. These are the best in my opinion. We can see here that this bulb yielded the most neutral of the 3 bulbs, and the skin tones look great. I would definitely try to use these bulbs whenever possible. Here are the bulbs and the skin tones together to see the differences more clearly. And so, as you saw, just by having good LED bulbs or an incandescent bulb, I still wouldn't recommend CFL bulbs. You can actually make a drastic difference in the quality of your lighting just by changing out the light bulbs, rearranging what you have in the house, or going out to the dollar store and buying one for real cheap. Now, there's a lot of big misconceptions here about what actually makes a light hard and what makes a light soft. The big misconception is how we get from one type of light to the other. Oftentimes you see online these round 5-in-1 diffusers being sold, or on big sets you see them put up big squares of diffusion, and what they're all doing is actually the same thing. They're all making the light source bigger relative to the subject. And I know that may sound confusing at first, but if we take a look at this example, I think it'll be a little more clear. You can distinguish hard light by sharp, distinct shadows. You can see this on the shadow coming from my nose and my neck. However, with soft light, you can see that the shadows become extremely soft and feathered if non-existent altogether. When we look at the light used without diffusion, we see that the source is relatively small, creating harder light. Whereas when we add the diffusion, we can see that the light source effectively triples in size. This applies to distance as well. You can see as the light I'm moving gets close to the figure, the shadow goes from harder to softer. This is because the light source becomes bigger relative to the size of the figure. Just like how the enormous sun seems so small from a distance, and why we get such hard shadows in the middle of the day. And what I like most about this information is the fact that it completely changes the way you get light. You don't always need diffusion. You don't always need a light that produces specifically hard light. By changing the distance to the subject, by changing how you use the light, you can actually create softer or harder light and get what you need and just be more resourceful overall, and not necessarily need to rely on specific tools all the time. I'm a big believer that the contrast in your image can imply a lot of context into your film, whether it's nighttime, whether it's dramatic, whether it's daytime, whether it's sunset. And if you pay attention every day, what differentiates all of those things is not just the direction of the light, it's the amount of light that bounces in the room, the amount of light that comes into the other side of the face, the amount of light that hits the ceiling, hits the floor. That's all your ambient light and your fill light. How I like to often play with fill light is sometimes bouncing light into the ceiling, or even taking a big soft source and coming from the front. And that may sound counterintuitive to getting contrast, because you'd think, doesn't that just create flat lighting? But the advantage you have with light coming from the front is you don't see the shadow it creates necessarily. If the light's coming directly from the camera and is lined up perfectly, all the shadows of your subject, of the items, fall behind and are hidden behind the subjects and the objects themselves. And you can actually, cheat a lot more fill than you would normally get if you don't have somewhere to bounce off of, or if you don't have a big helium balloon filled with LED strips. All the fancy stuff you can get away with just filling from the front. So with my setup, I tried filling from the front. You can see how the fill light in the right side of my face increases and the background also gets slightly brighter. When bouncing the light off the ceiling, we can see that the fill increasing on my face looks slightly more natural, but at the cost of uncontrolled light spilling across the walls around me. And as you can see, without using additional tools and just changing the position of our fill light, we can achieve different looks to fit our needs. Those last three ways I talked about are more in the line of lighting theory and how you change your way of thinking about light in order to get different results. But these next two are more general creative ideas, not necessarily to use every single time, because again, we want to stray away from having all of our films look the same, but hopefully just ways to get your creativity stirring. And the first of those is called a wet down. And what that is you take your scene, you grab a hose, grab a bucket of water, just get some way to grab water and get that scene wet. And what this does is it allows light to bounce off of the water on the ground, and this can create really dynamic images where you get to play around with symmetry and bright lights, but also complete darkness, and just overall create more dynamic images. And the last one is something a lot of people have talked about. It's pretty obvious, but it's the time of day that you shoot. When we're working with no money, one of the only ways we can control how the lighting looks is by waiting. For example, the one everybody knows is golden hour. At this time of day, the sun's lower, it feels more directional because it's lower, and we get, as the name suggests, this nice golden quality to the light that is very pleasing. Another popular time is called blue hour, where it's the time either just before the sun rises or just after it sets, where you no longer get direct light from the sun, but it's where the sky isn't completely dark yet because it's still receiving light from the sun just over the horizon. And we can take advantage of that and shoot scenes that we can fake for nighttime, or get a nice evening look where all the light's really soft. Just different variables that we can now have access to create the look we want. One time of day that a lot of people actually say to avoid is noontime or the late morning, early afternoon. However, you can actually get a lot of really cool looks from it. It may not always look the most pleasing, but sometimes you want that harsh look. Sometimes you want things to look imperfect. For example, you can use it in a Western to create a harsh looking sun, because as humans, innately, we all know what sun in the middle of the day looks like. It's usually the most intense, the time where it's beating down the most. And if we want that feeling for our scene, we can have it for free just by waiting for that time of day. Obviously, it takes a little more control, but again, it's free and we don't need big lights to get it. I just thought I'd share some of the things that really helped me just rethink lighting in general. Because if you're able to separate your work from getting the next aperture light, or, oh, this would look better if I had a sky panel, we can just take our knowledge and manipulate the lights that we have to get the results that we want. And oftentimes when we do that, we get looks that look better than using those tools. Not because those tools aren't good, but because we're thinking more about our lighting versus having the tool and thinking that our tool is going to give us good lighting. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please hit the like button, and I'll have a lot more of it coming, so if you want to see it, please hit subscribe and hit that bell button. Thanks.